Mark Leonard founded his first think tank in 1998 when he was 24 years old. At the time, he was working closely with Prime Minister Tony Blair. He later founded the European Council on Foreign Relations in 2007. This was the first pan-European think tank. He remains the director there. Mark, thanks for being with us today.
Thanks for inviting me.
Yeah, it's good to see you. So we're going to talk about several books today, a few of your own and a few others as well, probably. But
okay.
Before we do that, why don't we start at the beginning, or close to the beginning, back in the day with a little bit of history. As I understand, when you were 24, you had just come out of Cambridge and you founded a think tank at that point. This was the late 90s, and you were working with Tony Blair. Can you tell us a little bit about that period, what it was like to work with Prime Minister Blair, and about what you were doing?
Sure. So I grew up in Brussels. My dad was British. He was a journalist. My mum was German. She was a professor at university. And I've been very involved in all things to do with Europe through biography, through where I was kind of growing up. And then just before I went to college, before I went to university, I spent a year working in the British Parliament. And it was a time when Britain was just signed up to the Maastricht Treaty, which was this kind of big European debate. And there was a massive fight in British politics around Europe, which defined everything. And I was kind of working for a Labour member of Parliament on the European issue, and was very involved in a lot of the issues around that to do with identity, to do with defence. But it was a sort of dividing line in politics, particularly in the Conservative Party, which was very split at that time. And then I went to university, but through that period, the Labour Party was also going through a big debate about where it was going. It had just lost the election in 1992, but they'd seen Bill Clinton win the election in the US. And there was a debate about how to reshape the Labour Party. And one of the people who I saw from a distance, but became very kind of inspired by was Tony Blair, who was a young opposition politician who was involved in a lot of the debates about where the Labour Party should go. And then while I was still at university, he ended up becoming leader of the Labour Party because John Smith, who was the leader before that, had died, and he was elected the leader of the Labour Party and started to modernise the Labour Party and rethink how it worked. And there was a real intellectual ferment around the Labour Party then and around the centre-left, because the Conservatives had been in power for 18 years. They were very tired, very divided, and the European issue had really led to a complete breakdown of party discipline in the Conservative Party, and they slightly lost their way. And the Labour Party was trying to carve out a new idea of what politics could be. And it was a particularly exciting period because a lot of the people who'd been involved traditionally in the party had either got fed up and bored after almost 20 years of waiting for Labour to get into power. But also, because of the project of renewal, Tony Blair was trying to look forward and was so it was a great time for young people who didn't have any kind of baggage. And I was very young, I was in my early 20s. And I, as soon as I came out of college, went to work briefly as a journalist at The Economist, but then I worked for a think tank called Demos, which was very much part of the ferment of intellectual rethinking on the left, and came up with a lot of the ideas which were involved in New Labour. And the head of Demos went on to become Tony Blair's head of policy in Downing Street. And I ran their Europe program, helped them think about Europe, but also I did a big project on rebranding Britain, which led to a lot of fuss around Cool Britannia and the idea of Britain as a kind of modern country. And through that, it became clear that whilst there was a lot of interesting work being done on the left around domestic policy, how to rethink welfare, how to rethink policies on crime, how to rethink every sort of aspect of the government agenda. On foreign policy and on international issues, there was much less being done. You had a number of very venerable institutions, but which were seen as kind of dusty and quite conservative and backward-looking. And the foreign secretary then was a man called Robin Cook, who's now sadly no longer with us. And Tony Blair basically wanted to set up a new think tank which could help the Labour Party come up with a new way of thinking about the world in a more progressive way. And I was 24 years old and fearless and full of energy and excitement. And so I basically agreed to set this think tank up. And it was meant to be very much a product of the time that we're in. So the starting point was not just to look at individual countries and regions and what they were doing, but there's a lot of thinking about globalization and what it meant and what it means to live in an interdependent world.
Mark, your first book had a fantastic title, and it goes back to 2005, and it's a good way to bring in a lot of these themes that you mentioned. But it was titled "Why Europe Will Run the 21st Century." So, as you suggested, the world was a very different It was a very different scene at the time. There was a lot more optimism. Of course, Britain was part of the EU still. I wonder if you could tell us a little bit about what was the thesis of that book, what was the general argument, and how much of that remains true today, or how has it changed?
So it's interesting. The book's called Why Europe Will Run the 21st Century. I actually wrote it in Washington, and it was partly a contribution to a civil war within the West, which had started after 9/11, when there were debates about how to deal with Islamic terrorism, and particularly about whether to invade Iraq and to launch the Iraq War. And this was something which was very divisive in transatlantic relations, very divisive within the UK, and Blair ended up supporting the Iraq War. It was something which I think had a very damaging impact on his reputation, and is one of the things which eventually contributed to him leaving the political scene. And I think it also meant that a lot of his dreams in terms of transforming Britain in other areas, on Europe and in other areas, had to be put on the back burner as a result of the political capital that got burnt on the Iraq War. But one of the things that came out of that debate around Iraq was a discussion about power and about international relations and how the world should work. And there was a very influential essay written by Bob Kagan, which it started out as an essay called Power and Weakness, and then he turned it into a book called Paradise and Power. And essentially in that, he was making a contrast between European and American views of the world. America was power. Europe was weakness in his mind. But it was a very interesting book where he looked at different philosophies of how to think about how the world should be organized.
It was provocative, I remember. I mean, it raised a lot of
And he basically used these two philosophers as kind of archetypes for the American and the European approach. So he basically said that Americans, like Thomas Hobbes, they believe in a world of kind of power where, it's like a war between everyone all the time, and life is nasty, British, short, solitary. Yeah. Whereas the Europeans, it's like Immanuel Kant and
perpetual peace,
etc. Yeah. My book was partly an attempt to answer Kagan's response. And my basic thesis was actually that the only way that you could think about this as a debate between power and weakness is if you had a very outdated understanding of what power was. That in the kind of 21st century, in an interdependent world, you need to think about power in quite different ways to the way that we thought about power in the 19th century or even the first half of the 20th century. And I argued that the European Union was a very different way of thinking about how political power could be organized, which was both really exciting, very successful, but actually something which was quite revolutionary, in some ways almost as revolutionary as the last big invention about how political power should be organized, which was the creation of the nation state and the idea of a world that was governed by nation states. Before that, you'd had, empires and principalities and all sorts of city-states and other things like that. And when the nation state emerged, it was such a powerful way of doing things that actually, over the course of of a few decades, a few or centuries, that everybody else turned into nation states, and that became the kind of dominant form of political organisation. And what I found exciting and interesting about the European Union was that it was a different way of thinking about how power could be organised and how security could be done. And instead of having a centralised bureaucracy like you have in a kind of nation state, what I thought was exciting about the EU was that organised power in a kind of decentralised network where countries could enjoy the benefits of scale that you get from being part of something really big. So having a huge market, being able to cooperate on foreign policy and defence issues where scale really matters and where you want to be able to face up head to head with the US, with China, with really big nation states. But at the same time, it kept most of the things that people really cared about much closer to ordinary people. So the European Union, isn't a nationality. It's not trying to build a nation. It doesn't interfere with your ability to be French or German or Italian or Spanish or even British. The decisions on the things that you really care about, whether it's about taxation, whether it's about education policy, whether it's about all the delivery of services, they're all made much closer to the individual level. And the way that people think about security is very different as well. So before that, the last few centuries of European history have been defined by tales of war between different European countries. Several times in the last century, Europe's been turned into a kind of mass graveyard in the First World War, in the Second World War, but in the 19th century, there were just decades and decades of wars going on, particularly between France and Germany, but everyone was dragged into these continental bloodbaths, which erupted regularly. And in those days, people thought about security as a sort of balance of power between different countries. There was a very firm divide between internal affairs, between domestic policy and foreign policy. And basically, domestic policy, countries should be allowed to do whatever they wanted. Foreign policy was about the balance of power and secrecy, etc. Whereas what the EU did was it actually turned all that on its head, and it said, okay, the way that we can be safe ourselves is not by building walls and borders, but it's actually by integrating ourselves so that we break down the borders between our different countries. And Jean Monnet, who's the founder of the European Union, had this, his original idea was taking the technologies which countries had used to declare war on each other, so coal and steel, which were used to make weapons in the First World War and the Second World War, and to turn them into the basis of peace. So they started out with a coal and steel community, where you took these industries which were used to make weapons and you actually pooled them together and you created a common industrial base between France and Germany, the two kind of big antagonists that had dragged Europe into war endlessly. And then on the basis of coal and steel, you then look at other things that you can do together, and you end up building a common market, and then a single market, and then a single currency, and you get rid of borders between these different countries, and people become so closely bound up in each other's affairs that it was not only very difficult to declare war on each other, it's actually unthinkable because it's so difficult to extricate yourself from each other. And the way that it's worked is through the rule of law. So rather than having separate laws which create barriers between different places, what they had to do was to try and find a way of using laws to bind people together so that you could trust that other people would hold by their words. So over the years, they built this set of common rules, like a rule book, which everyone agreed to be bound by. And it's ended up being 80,000 pages long. And every country that wanted to join the European Union, it was like a club. You had to kind of integrate the rule book.
80,000 pages? Did I hear that correctly?
80,000 pages. In fact, about 20 years ago, I was involved in trying to do an exhibition on the idea of Europe with the Dutch architect Rem Koolhaas. And we had this great thing which we did where his practice basically got this circus tent which we put in the middle of the Rond-Point Schuman, which is like the main it's like it's the centre of the European Union's operations in Brussels. We got this huge circus tent in the middle and then had an exhibition which showed it. But one of the things we did was we actually printed out all 80,000 pages.
Wow.
And created this book with all of the different laws. And it goes on for yards and yards. It was this kind of massive centre point that almost filled half of this circus tent. Anyway, that is the kind of operating rule book which everyone signs up to. And when countries join, because the European Union started very small with just 6 founding countries, and it went up to 28. It's now back down to 27 after Brexit. But there are lots of other countries that want to join, Ukraine, Moldova, all the countries in the Western Balkans. But whenever countries want to join, one of the things they have to do is take these 80,000 pages of laws and introduce them into their national legal frameworks. So people are kind of going through and they're voting them through. So you internalize a lot of these things. And then you're in charge of making sure that because it becomes part of your national law. So you're not being told to do it by other people. You're voluntarily committing to sign up to this rule book, and then your courts...
But you still have to follow the rule book in order to sign up, right?
But one of the reasons that it's more legitimate is that it's not foreign... it's your national parliament that decides to pass these laws, and it's your courts which then act as the custodians of it. And there is a European Court of Justice which oversees all so, a bit like the Supreme Court in the US, you can refer, if you feel that people are breaking the laws and you don't think that the national courts have done their job in enforcing those laws, you can, in extreme circumstances, refer it to the European Court of Justice, who can then look at what's happening. But that European Court of Justice is also something with judges from every single country in Europe. So it's not foreigners telling you how to run your own affairs. It's your own country. And that, I think, is one of the reasons why the European Union has been accepted and has managed to survive for such a long period of time, is that it's a kind of, in some ways, it's a bit like an empire, but it's a voluntary empire which people have chosen to join, often had to wait a very long time to get in. It's really difficult to get in. Lots of countries would love to be in the European Union and aren't in it at the moment and have been waiting for a very long period of time.
So it sounds like even post Brexit, you're still relatively optimistic about the future of the European Union, what it might accomplish in the world. What is that? Is that the case?
Yes. Look, sorry, it was a very long answer, but so my book, in a way, was sort of a celebration of what had been achieved within Europe. And in part of the book, I wrote it in 2005, which was just after 10 countries that had been part of the Soviet Empire basically had thrown off the yoke of communism and of Soviet occupation and domination and become independent countries. And the first thing they wanted to do was to join the European Union. So you'd seen the map of Europe fundamentally changing with countries like Poland and Hungary and the Czech Republic, becoming part of the West, and their populations really desperate to join the European Union. So it was partly the wave of optimism that had just gone on within Europe, which was being reflected, as well as an attempt to push back on the criticism of people like Kagan and others who were kind of saying that this was weak. In fact, I was saying it was very strong. It's very rare that you see these sort of big geopolitical changes that we just saw to Europe. 20 years on, how does it look? I think that a lot of what I was celebrating in the book, I think, is still right. I think it's a very inspiring political model. I think that the European Union has contributed to peace within Europe and has helped to make it unthinkable for countries like France and Germany to go to war with each other, has helped transform a lot of these countries. There has been there have been a lot of problems as well. We had the Euro crisis, which showed the difficulties of creating a single currency without having a common treasury. You had Brexit, the fact that Britain left the European Union, which I think has got a lot more to do with problems in British political life and British politics, particularly around the management of migration, than it had to do with problems endemic in the EU. And there have also been big backlashes in some of the countries that joined, like in Hungary, for example, and in Poland, where there were big threats to the rule of law which were taking place. Poland has since then, in fact, changed its government and re-embraced its kind of European future. And then there have been questions about Europe on the world stage and its ability to defend itself, particularly in the face of Russian aggression, which we're seeing in Ukraine at the moment. And I think one of the biggest challenges for Europeans is how you can have one attitude towards your neighbours within the European Union, which is all about the rule of law, about peace, about living in this Kantian world, and another approach when it comes to dealing with the big bad world that's outside. And that's what Putin has brought into very sharp relief, because you can't, if you're dealing with people who won't obey the rule of law, who are willing to use force to change borders, the only language which they understand is one of force. And the European Union has got so used to depending on the US for protection that it took quite a long time for Europeans to get their act together and to actually do what they needed to do to defend their own security. I think they've come a long way, actually, since 2022, when Putin launched his full-scale invasion of Ukraine. But there's still a long way to go.
Defense budgets are going up as a percentage of GDP, and how much does that? Because it really was, as you described it, it was almost a minimalist project when it first began in the 1940s and 50s, and now this increase in military budgets really is a fairly dramatic change. Is that going to alter the character of the European Union?
So I think the character is kind of changing. I mean, I wrote an essay recently where I kind of talk about how for the first few decades of the EU, it was a peace project, which was about basically trying to tame sovereignty, to reduce the role of military power, and to change the way that people thought about their internal security. But since 2022, it's been a war project. So it's been about trying to help countries invest in their military defense, how they can pool resources, how you can help Ukraine defend itself. And it is very dramatic. If you go back 10 years, most countries in the EU were spending, way less than the 2% which they promised to spend on defense within NATO. And now, as a collective, the EU is spending over 2% on defence, and most of the countries are spending 2%. Some countries are spending a lot more than that. Poland, for example, which feels very threatened by the situation in Ukraine, is well over 2% target. And they're using lots of creative ways of both supporting Ukraine directly, but also thinking about how the EU can pump prime, innovation in the defence space, and how it can help get collaborative projects off the ground. And you're seeing quite a different approach to defence. But I think part of it is also a wider recognition that security isn't just about planes and missiles and ships, but actually in the 21st century, security is become part of everything that governments do. So there's a big debate around energy security. Is it safe to rely just on Russian gas? So, you had the kind of remarkable situation where before the full-scale invasion, Russia was the biggest single energy provider to Europe, and now people have had to find completely different sources for their energy, and there's been a total decoupling from Russian oil and gas. You're seeing ideas of technology controls and sanctions and data and migration, all the different kind of aspects of what governments do has become part of the security agenda. And that's also why the European Union really matters, actually, in the 21st century as a security partner to other countries. Because, if you think about the big competitions of the next few decades between China and the US and other countries, a lot of these are as much to do with technology, with data, with AI, with the energy transition, as they are to do with sort of classic questions of war and peace. I mean, I'm not saying that those kind of traditional areas don't matter anymore. We've learned in quite a dramatic way how much they do matter. But I think they're part of a bigger spectrum of geopolitical competition. And the European Union, I think, is in the thick of it and has been actually part of the process of helping countries in Europe reinvent their approach to security.
So we've talked about Britain, we've talked about the European Union, we've talked a little bit about the US. We haven't talked about the other major geopolitical player on the scene, which of course is China. Let me see if I can do this by a book by Ivan Krastev and Stephen Holmes, The Light That Failed, Why the West is Losing the Fight for Democracy. One of the arguments in the book by Krastev and Holmes, and Krastev, by the way, was the Kissinger chair a few years ago here at the Kluge Center as well. One of the arguments that they make is that part of the reason why countries have soured on the idea of liberal democracy is because those who have been its proponents have been so almost dogmatic and at times hypocritical in how they've presented it, because they've presented it as a shining beacon and really tried in an almost missionary effort to get everyone to adopt it in a very whole-scale, dramatic way. They also make the case that China is interested in developing a sphere of influence, but they're much more interested in developing that on an economic level, on a political level, but they seem to be less interested in promoting the way they conduct government. So it's not a proselytizing effort, so to speak. Europe is somewhere in between these two, between the U.S., or seems to be between the U.S. model of wanting to promote liberal democracy, the Chinese model of being hands-off. Where is Europe situated in this picture? How is that changing, and how do you see this tension?
So, firstly, I mean, it's a brilliant book, The Light That Failed, and is such a powerful description of how the story that we've been talking about for the last 20 minutes or so has unraveled, actually. So you're going from the extreme optimism around the beginning of this century to a situation now where there's a lot of pushback against liberal democracy, both outside but also within our societies, which is reflected in our national politics. I think that Europe is on a journey as well, and actually, it's been as much part of proselytizing as the US has, just in a different way. And that civil war, which in the West, which I talked about in 2003, was about these different ways of thinking about how you promote your ideas. Yeah. A US one, which was then embodied in the Bush administration, which was much more reliant on military power and invading countries and regime change, and the European one, which was about kind of slow societal transformation. But you had the same missionary zeal in Brussels as you had in Washington. And I think what is very interesting is the way that during this last 20 years or so, China has very quietly become part of the everyday lives of many, many countries around the world, and has offered an alternative to what the Europeans and the Americans were pushing. I wrote another book back in 2008 called What Does China Think?, which was an attempt to try and understand the intellectual debates within China. I spent a lot of time over the last few decades going back and forth to China, engaging with Chinese thinkers. And what's very interesting is that China, in some ways, was part of because the Krastev-Holmes book is very much about how countries were imitating the West and trying to become part of the West. And, in the 1980s and the 1990s, China was playing catch-up and was absorbing a lot of know-how and technology from the West and going from being a socialist economy to a different kind of state capitalist economy, but with markets, and was going through that kind of transformation. But my book on what does China think, was partly about looking at the backlash within China to that process of imitation, and the attempt by a lot of Chinese thinkers to emancipate China from Western ways of understanding the world and to develop a different Chinese model, a sort of Beijing consensus. And that's something which started quietly and has become more and more part of the way that China thinks about itself and talks about itself. And now, under Xi Jinping, we're in a very different space where people do talk about the Chinese model. But what's interesting is that China has always thought about Chinese characteristics and talks about Chinese characteristics, and their kind of mental model for how the world works is a much more plural one, where you have lots of different civilizations and different systems living side by side. Whereas the American idea from Woodrow Wilson onwards is that you'd have a single way of thinking about it. It's very much about one world with one, the end of history, a single sustainable model for human progress, as the Bush national security strategy put it. And that is quite different. And one of their advantages is that China has been playing catch up. So it's not been, it was smaller than the UK economy when I first started working on global political issues. So they're not promoting it in the same way that the Western countries are, but they are providing an alternative to the West in many places. And that has been very attractive to other countries, because by having different alternatives, they can play them off against each other, and they can find more space to find their own way within the system. And I think one of the challenges for Western policymakers now is that they've often had a sort of slightly false idea of what China is and what China they're dealing with. So for most of the last 25 years, Western policymakers have thought of China as a country that was becoming like us. And when Bob Zoellick was Deputy Secretary of State, he talked about China becoming a responsible stakeholder for the kind of global international order. And there was, I think, a false idea that China was trying to become like us, and that it would uphold the liberal international order and become a stakeholder in the international.
At the time of WTO accession and all of those movements, yeah.
And that carried on well after it was quite clear that China wasn't trying to achieve that they had a different project. But then, rather than replacing it with a more realistic assessment of what China is and what kind of threat China poses, we flipped into a different idea of China, which is as a kind of new Soviet Union with its own ideology of autocracy, and to think about ourselves in a new Cold War with China and this sort of multi-generational, all-society competition which would go on for a long period of time. And I think that's no more helpful than the idea of China as definitely it will be a kind of multi-generational, all-society competition against China. But they're not behaving like the former Soviet Union, where they have a kind of clear ideology which is very different to Western ideology. There are not communist parties in every country around the world that are trying to implement the Chinese system. And instead, I think what the Chinese have been very good at is trying to pose as partners for development to other places, and to criticize the West for Cold War thinking, and for forcing people to choose between different blocs. And instead, the Chinese are trying to argue that they believe in a kind of idea of multiple paths to modernity, and where countries can choose their own paths, and that China can be a sort of partner for a world of multi-alignment. And that is a much more subtle challenge than the one which a lot of Western policymakers think that they're dealing with.
Mark, your most recent book is titled The Age of Unpeace, How Connectivity Causes Conflict. It's from 2021. And one of the stories you tell in the book, or in the introduction, you talk about how you had set out to imagine a grand new global architecture for foreign policy. But then you had a moment actually in a bookstore in Beijing, where you had a revelation of sorts, and that set you on a different trajectory. And from there, you developed a metaphor that's much more based on the idea of looking at analogies with personal relationships and what those dynamics look like. Tell us a little bit about this bookstore and how your thinking changed during that time.
So if we go back to the very beginning of this conversation, we were talking about all kind of optimism of a connected world where eventually we were going to get rid of conflict and we'd have a world of perpetual peace because we were all interdependent. Globalization was going to create common economic interest in being together. The internet was going to create a space for a common political space. People were going to travel freely across borders. Big problems like climate change would actually remind us that we're all human and that we'd have to work together. And there was a sort of sense that we were becoming one world. And then something went wrong somewhere along the way. And my book is very much about how all the things that were meant to be bringing us together end up driving us apart. And I kind of used a metaphor to explain geopolitics in the 2020s of the world. It's a bit like a marriage which goes wrong, where the couple can't stand each other's company, but they can't get divorced either. And as within a marriage where, you know, it's all the things which bring people together in the good times that they end up using to hurt each other in the bad times, that same thing's happening with globalization and global politics. So in a marriage, you know, it's about who gets the, well, I'm showing my age, but the CD collection or the holiday home, the pet, and above all, the children. That's how people manipulate these things to try and hurt each other. And in geopolitics, it's also all the things that brought us together in the good times. So, you know, trade ends up being manipulated, and you have sanctions, and you try and blackmail people. Energy links, you blackmail each other. The internet, you use it for electoral interference and cyber attacks. Migration, you force people from their homes, and you use that to try and hurt other players. So literally all the things which were meant to be bringing us together are kind of driving us apart. So I was trying to work out a way of thinking about how we could solve these problems. And I was in a bookshop in Beijing, and I came across a book called Facing Codependency by a woman called Pia Melody. And she sort of explained how we should think differently about interdependence, that it was often turning into something which was toxic, where we were trapped in a relationship which wasn't working very well for either side, and that you couldn't really get out of the relationship, you couldn't really fix it, but you had to sort of think about how you could make it work in a way that was less damaging and less toxic for yourself. It was actually a self-help book rather than a geopolitical tone. But I realized actually that it was a very good way of thinking about how you deal with geopolitical problems at the moment. And so I kind of tried to set out a 5-step program in my book for how you could reimagine geopolitics, which was thinking about how we can live together in a world with very low levels of trust, with different systems where we don't necessarily like each other, but where we can't simply rely on the rule of law and we can't kind of decouple from each other. And you know, the starting point is sort of realizing that there's a problem with all of these sort of psychological ailments. So that's what I sort of try and do in the book, is to sort of explain what the problem is. And then, you know, you need to think about how you can make yourself stronger and work on yourself. And I think there's a lot of that in these debates about industrial strategy, which we've been talking about earlier. So people thinking about how they can make their economies more resilient, how they can you think about how you can maybe have selective decoupling so that you're less vulnerable to other people interfering with your own affairs. And anyway, there are various different steps, 5 steps, which I kind of talk about, but which are largely about how you can de-risk interdependence. Because I don't think we want to go back to a world of walls where we have nothing to do with each other. And where I think the economic costs are going to be too great. I think people have got so used to the advantages and the conveniences of globalization and the internet. But at the same time, if we carry on our current path, the idea of my book, The Age of Unpeace, is that some horrible catastrophes could take place, whether it's massive cyber attacks, whether it's pandemics kind of spreading around the world, whether it's the catastrophic effects of uncontrolled climate change, or whether it's people weaponizing our global financial system. There are all sorts of things which could go wrong. One of the difficulties of a world where everything is being weaponized and turned into a weapon is that it's much harder to control our security than in the world of the Cold War, where you had to worry about nuclear warheads and a few kind of clear technologies. Now the dividing line between war and peace has been eroded, and actually it's a lot harder to think about how we can make ourselves safe. But that's really what the book is about, is to think about what kind of practices we can do. And a lot of them start with our national politics rather than thinking about the United Nations and the global international system.
Mark, thanks again for being with us today.
Great, thank you very much.